Hello, this is my movie analysis, and I chose McFarland, which is basically about a new cross country team that, a new cross country coach for a cross country team in a primarily dominated Latino town. And this coach's name is Coach White, and he was originally fired from his last coaching job, and so he goes here and hopes to help this team out as he can't help out this last team because he was fired. And the team in the movie shows throughout this team the economical and family problems that they have like struggled due to their culture in their like Latino background, since the whole town is basically Latino except for Coach White. And it shows these cultural differences, and they all work through all these problems throughout this movie. And if you don't want to know what happens, skip this. But they end up winning the state champion for the cross country that year. And I'm pretty sure it's based on a real life. It is based off a real life movie, a real life example. And they win the state championship with the same team like 2 or 3 years in a row. If I'm mistaken, I'm pretty sure that's how it is though. It was really incredible. I love the movie. It's one of my favorite movies. And yeah, for the first question, the biggest competent communicator in this movie to me was Coach White. I believe that there could be a lot of different characters that could fit this role, but I think Coach White showed just like how like traverse he could be with his communication. And the one scene that really like did it for me was when Thomas, which is the star cross country runner, the best one on the team, was having some family problems back at home, and he even earlier that day at practice, due to these family problems, ended up quitting the team and yelling at Coach White. And Coach White was driving by, ironically, as he has his own family problems, and he was getting a cake for his daughter, who he had missed his daughter's birthday earlier. And as Coach White was driving by, he sees him up on a bridge, and he's like, that's my runner, I gotta go talk to him. So as Coach White goes up there, and Thomas is just sitting there quietly on the bridge, and he's really, really close to falling off. Coach White's like, Thomas, what are you doing? And he's showing, like, he's obviously not yelling at him like he would at practice. He's being gentle with him, and he eventually opens up to him emotionally about why, because Thomas is like, why are you out so late, Coach White? And he tells him why, about how he was a bad father and he missed his daughter's birthday. And Coach White's like, no, sorry, Thomas is like, Coach White, that is terrible of you to do. And eventually, as Coach White's like distracting him and trying to like get him off the bridge, he's like, Thomas, if you fall off this bridge, you're not gonna die from it. You're gonna be severely injured, but you won't die. You don't want that. And he eventually distracts him to enough where he can pull him off the bridge, and he saves his life basically, because who knows what Thomas would have done. And Thomas just hugs him and just is crying into him. And I think this display of Coach White being able to communicate with Thomas so well in such like a very could have been a very bad situation is what showed me as his biggest competent communicator. For the second question, I think the movie itself is very huge on culture, especially within the Latino community, and one of the interpersonal communications that were affected in this movie is the runners eventually threw a quinceanera for Coach White's daughter, and they had no idea about any of this, but in Latino culture, a quinceanera, is extremely like popular for girls who turn 15, and they throw it for everyone. And they ended up throwing one for Coach White's daughter, and they're like, this is great. And this could also be a gender difference, because if Coach White's daughter was a son, she would not have got a quinceanera, because that's just how it is. Only the girls are getting quinceaneras, not the boys. Another culture thing was that 3 of the 7 runners had to quit the team because they had to work in the fields for their family. And this was cultural because in the Latino community, and especially in that town, is all they would do is work in these fields. That's how they live their life. And Coach White, he ended up changing that for these runners, which was great. And another gender difference in this movie was that they believed strongly within traditional family roles. So as the boys were working out in the field, a lot of the daughters and wives would be at home cleaning and cooking. The two main characters in this movie were the coach and the star runner, but I chose Thomas for number 3 because Thomas's perception of Coach White being white was that his life was already imperfect and he never had experienced poverty in life like he did. And he would ultimately end up quitting because Coach White had just made him super duper mad. And this was due to his culture. And he was like, I can't be running because that's not what my family wants me to do. I should be working in the fields. And Thomas's perception of Coach White, another one, was that when he found out Coach White had been took that coaching job so he could get a better coaching job somewhere else, Thomas was extremely mad and angry at him because he was like, you did all this just to end up betraying us and go to somewhere else to coach instead at a better school. You just wanted this for yourself, not to actually help us. And this caused many arguments throughout the movie between the two, but they eventually got over it at the end. For number 4, an example of the runners calling Coach White Coach Blanco because they're Latino and that's how they communicate in Spanish, so they would just call him Coach Blanco instead. Another time language was used was Coach was talking to Thomas's father, and he was trying to talk to him in Spanish, but he ended up knowing English, and Coach White didn't know that, so he kind of looked like a fool, and kind of a little maybe of a racist for trying to speak to him in Spanish when he was actually he knew English. And the last use of language is that Coach White's quinceañera for his daughter, they would play Mexican songs, and they wouldn't play any English songs. It would only be Mexican songs and stuff. A big nonverbal communication in this movie is clapping because Coach White is clapping at his runners. He wants them to go faster, and that's how you're clapping to them. You want them to run faster, but as they're running by in a race, if you yell, if you're gonna try to actually say something, that's not gonna. The runners won't know what you're saying because they're running so fast. But if you're clapping, you're like, "That's my coach clapping. I gotta go." Another non-verbal communication is when Thomas was pointing at Danny Diaz, rather than saying "Look, coach, look at that." He was just pointing at him like it was the most miracle thing ever. And the last nonverbal communication, which is pretty obvious, is when the runners are tired or anything, their body language, they have their hands over their head or on their knees. And Coach White, he would know that his runners are tired without actually being told that they are tired. For number 6, I spoke of Thomas earlier about being on the bridge and Coach White walking up to him, and he wasn't exactly oh, this is Coach White behind me. He wasn't saying anything to Coach White. He was just kind of listening to him for the most part of it. He was he eventually started talking back to him and ended up crying to him, but he was he wasn't really listening, or he wasn't really talking back to him. He was just listening to what Coach White had to say. And then, as another example of Thomas listening, was when he went back at home, earlier in the day before he went to the bridge, he was at home, and before he walked in, he heard his parents arguing, and his dad was slamming stuff. And as he was listening, he realized that it was going too far, so he rushed in to stop it. He was like, "You gotta stop this. This is not right." The way Thomas portrays his emotions for number 7 was him crying on the bridge after White's conversation. He just hugged White, and he was just crying into his shoulder because it was just such a bad, sad situation. And Coach White portrayed his emotions for being upset with himself because he had failed his family and he had failed his daughter for missing her birthday, and he was even told not to miss her birthday, but he still did that. And one last way emotion was expressed was Coach White's daughter portraying her anger and frustration with her dad for missing her birthday, because she would just constantly slam the door in his face whenever he tried to talk to her, or just completely ignore her instead, because she was just so upset with him. An example of conflict that was within the movie was the 3 Diaz brothers, who were 3 of the 7 runners on the team, and they were all brothers from the same family, obviously, and they all were forced to quit because of their parents, and they were being forced to work in the fields, which is a huge thing in the Latino community down there, and they were being forced. And Coach White decided that he was going to go out and work in the fields to see how it was. And as they're working, they came to the compromise that if they worked in the fields in the morning to get the money for their families, like that's what they wanted, they'd be able to come run in the afternoon, and that was just the best scenario for everybody. And that was like a huge conflict at first, though, because 3 of the 7 runners would mean that they wouldn't be able to compete as a team anymore, and the whole thing would have been done for. Another example of conflict was White's family and his desire for coaching conflicting throughout the movie. As I said earlier, he had missed his daughter's birthday for the very reason that he was out coaching his team at practice, and they went super long. They had an extra long practice, and it just so happened that it was his daughter's birthday, and he just completely forgot about it because he was so invested in his team. And that was a huge conflict throughout the movie. A supportive communication climate that was seen throughout this movie was Coach White giving them a congratulations speech for when they made the final cut to be able to compete at state. Like, they were one of the few chosen to be able to go to state, and Coach White was just like, "This is what you guys have worked for all year. This is so impressive of you." And yeah, it was just all that. And a defensive communication climate was when Thomas was arguing with his father and trying to tell him that going to college was a good thing, but his father was like, "All those books are stupid. You should be out in the fields working like a real man," and all that. Finally, for number 10, Coach White, throughout the majority of the movie, he had showed a social exchange theory where he was only coaching the cross country team, so he could be able to go out and hopefully get a better coaching job at a more safer, richer neighborhood. And he didn't really want to be in the Latino community. He didn't want to be in that town. He was only there so he could try to get a better job somewhere else, and it worked because he ended up getting an interview for one of the more richer one of the richer high schools in that area. But eventually, at the end of the movie, which was very heartwarming, was when Coach White realized that even though maybe it might be like more money and safer in there, that all the relationships that he made with the people in the Latino community in the town, it was worth more than anything that the money could ever bring him. So yeah, that's how it was. Thank you.